At 4:17 a.m. on the morning of October 12, 1942, in Arbeitslager Osterode, a subcamp of gross-rosen, nestled in the frost-rimed foothills of the Sudets, the air tasted of cold dust and wet wool, and the ground beneath Block 14's thin floorboards vibrated with the distant thud of a rock crusher at the quarry. Inside, Klara Varga crouched beside her 8-year-old son, LSCL, her fingers chapped raw from lye soap and stone, dust gently brushing crumbs from his coat sleeve. The bread ration had arrived the night before, a single, dense loaf, for 6 women and 3 children, divided with surgical precision by the block elder. Klara had taken her portion, not to eat, but to crumble. Now in the dim glow filtering through a crack in the shuttered window, just enough to see the steam rise from their shared breath, she pressed a pinch of dark rye onto the splintered wood between them, then another, then a third, tracing a jagged line that curved like the vistula near Krakow. LSCL, silent as snowfall, watched. He'd learned early that sound drew guards, that hunger could be endured, but attention could kill. His mother's hands moved like a cartographer's, though she'd never held a compass or seen a printed map since the SS confiscated their belongings in Budapest 2 winters prior. What she drew now was memory made edible: the bend in the Olza River where her brother once fished, the cluster of birch trees that shielded a smuggler's path into Czechoslovakia, the ruined watchtower with its collapsed stairwell, the only blind spot in the camp's eastern perimeter. The crumbs trembled as a guard's boot scraped stone outside. Klara's breath hitched, but her hand never wavered. She added a final dot, charcoal this time, scraped from the stove pip, and whispered, "Remember, 3 steps past the fence post, then crawl." LSCL nodded. The map vanished before dawn, eaten not out of hunger, but necessitized, devoured to leave no trace. Around them, the block exhaled in sleep, the wet rasp of tuberculosis in the corner bunk, the rhythmic cough of Frau Beck near the stove, the muffled whimper of a woman dreaming of her vanished daughter. Klara's knees ached from the cold plank floor, her back stiff from 16 hours hauling slate slabs at the quarry, but she did not shift. Movement invited scrutiny. Even breathing too loudly could summon a capo with a rubber truncheon. She watched her son's eyes, instead those wide, dark pools that held more fear than wonder, and saw in them the reflection of her own resolve. This was not madness, it was mathematics. The camp held 237 prisoners, 42 of them children. The eastern fence stood 2.4 meters high, topped with coiled barbed wire. Patrols passed every 22 minutes, though never precisely, on the minute human rhythms betrayed by fatigue, by boredom, by the occasional stolen cigarette behind the latrine. The dogs grew sluggish after the noon feed. The floodlights flickered during the generator shift at 3 a.m. None of it mattered if you had nowhere to go, but Klara had been mapping escape routes in her mind since the transport from Hungary, stitching together fragments of memory, like a woman darning a threadbare coat. Every landmark she'd glimpsed from cattle car windows, every whispered rumor over washbasin lines, every glance at guard rotations, she'd stored it all, waiting for a way to make it real. Bread was the answer, not for sustenance, but for signa. The rye here was heavy, coarse, pressed with the grit of wartime mills that used whatever grain survived the requisitions. It held shape. It could be molded, scored, impressed, and when danger came, it could be erased with a single bite. Earlier that week, she'd tested it, drawing the outline of the quarry road on a scrap of floorboard, then eating the evidence while a capo stomped past. The woman hadn't even glanced down. Tonight was the full map, the one she'd refined through sleepless nights and silent rehearsals. Her finger traced the final segment, the dry creek bed beyond the watchtower, invisible from the guard posts, leading into the Carpathian foothills where partisans were said to hide. LSCL's hand found hers, small and cold. She squeezed once, 2 seconds. No more, and pointed to the charcoal dot. "That's where we stop walking," she murmured, her voice so low it barely disturbed the dust motes swirling in the sliver of moonlight. "We crawl until we hear owls. Then we run." Outside, a dog barked, sharp and sudden, followed by the metallic clink of a rifle sling. Klara froze, her body coiled like a spring. But the sound faded toward the western gate. She exhaled slowly, the warmth of it fogging the air between them. With deliberate care, she lifted the edge of the map and placed it in LSCL's palm. "Eat it," she whispered. The boy hesitated only a heartbeat before obeying, chewing without noise, his eyes never leaving hers. The last crumb disappeared just as the first gray light began to seep through the eastern sky, turning the frost on the window pane into silver lace. Somewhere beyond the wire, a rooster crowed a sound so ordinary, so impossibly alive, that Klara felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them back. Tears were luxury. Survival was a rhythm. And tonight, for the first time in 2 years, the equation balanced toward hope. Klara had been a schoolteacher once, not a spy or saboteur, just a woman who taught children to fold paper cranes and identify constellations through the glass dome of Budapest's planetarium. But the camp had stripped her of voice, of title, of certainty until it left her only with pattern recognition, the quiet superpower of those who watch while others command. She noticed things others ignored, how the sentries rotated every 90 minutes, not on the hour, how the floodlights flickered during generator shifts, how the dogs grew sluggish after the noon feed, when the kitchen scraps ran thin. She noticed, too, that the bread itself held secrets. The miller, in the nearby village, still used the old stone grinder, producing a loaf dense enough to retain shape when dampened, its texture ideal for imprinting. One evening, while scrubbing latrine tiles, under the eye of a woman whose perfume couldn't mask the sourness of fear, beneath her uniform Klara saw 2 Polish women, arguing over a scrap of newsprint hidden in a potato sack. The SS confiscated all paper, but paper could be faked, bread could not. That night, huddled under a single blanket with LSEL, she mixed a paste of saliva and ash, pressed it into the crust's crevices, and peeled away a negative of the eastern ridgeline. The next day, she tested it on the back of a guard's discarded cigarette packet, hidden beneath a pile of laundry. The map held. When she showed it to Marta, a seamstress from D, who'd lost 3 sons in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, the woman's eyes widened. "You'll get us all shot," Marta hissed, but her fingers traced the ridge. "Or free," Klara replied. By the end of the week, 7 women and 2 children knew the route. None spoke of it aloud. They practiced memorization in silence, tapping fingers on thighs, tracing lines in the frost on windows, rehearsing with nothing but crumbs and charcoal. Marta became the first to understand the elegance of impermanence. A former underground courier in the Polish Home Army, she knew that the most dangerous documents weren't hidden, they simply ceased to exist. "The bread disappears into the body," she told Klara one night, her voice a threadbare whisper as they sorted turnips in the kitchen shed. "No ash, no ashtray, no evidence. Even if they searched your stomach, they'll find only hunger." Klara nodded. Survival wasn't about defiance, it was about erasure. Every evening, after roll call, she refined the map, adding a shallow ford where the Olsa narrowed in autumn, marking a collapsed drainage culvert beneath the main road where patrols rarely looked down. She encoded distances in bytes, 2 mouthfuls to the birch grove, 1 swallow to the creek, so that even if recaptured, no one could confess what wasn't written down. LSEL learned faster than the adults. He'd memorize a segment each night, then recite it back using only blinks, 2 for a turn, 3 for a landmark, 1 long blink for danger. Klara watched him with a mixture of terror and pride. At 8, he already understood that silence was armor, that stillness was strategy. The camp's rhythms became their metronome. Mondays meant laundry duty, ideal for exchanging crumbs hidden in sock seams. Wednesdays brought the quarry detail, where dust clouds offered cover for whispered instructions. Fridays were the most dangerous. Medical inspections during which every seam was probed, every mouth examined for sores that might indicate typhus or hidden messages. Klara avoided Fridays for planning. Instead, she used them to observe. She studied the guards' habits, how Lieutenant Drescher always lit a cigarette after roll call, how the night patrol slowed near the latrines, how the dogs whined when the wind blew east, carrying the scent of the slaughterhouse miles away. Knowledge was currency, and Klara was rich in details no one else valued. One afternoon in late October, she noticed something new, a flaw in the camp's logic so small it bordered on invisible. The eastern sentry post, manned by a young Volksjoy named Hubner, never checked the storm drain at the base of the fence, not once. While others scanned the horizon with binoculars, Hubner kept his eyes level, nervous of being seen as lax. Klara filed it away. That night, she redrawn the map, adding a new path, through the drain, then up the dry creek bed. She tested it with a scrap of bread soaked in ditch water. It held. The next morning, she accidentally dropped her bowl near the drain during kitchen duty. As she knelt to pick it up, she measured the opening with her eyes just wide enough for a child, tight for an adult, but passable if one exhaled fully. She told no one yet. Knowledge unshared was safer. But LSEL saw her look, and knew. Marta began recruiting, not with words, but with glances, a nod during breadline, a brush of elbows at the wash basin. The 7 women formed a silent constellation. Irana, a former nurse who could identify edible plants. Zofia, a printer's daughter who understood ink and impression. Hannah, a Slovak farmhand who knew how to move through fields without leaving tracks. They each brought something to the plan, and each night, after lights out, they rehearsed in darkness, hands tracing phantom maps on thighs, breaths timed to the distant clang of the quarry bell. Klara never gave orders. She offered options. If the fog lifts, we wait. If the dogs bark toward the west gate, we go. Consensus emerged like roots through stone, slow, quiet, inevitable. Then came the inspection. A sudden sweep on November 1st, ordered after a rumor of sabotage at the main gross-rosen camp. Boots pounded through Block 14 at dawn. Mattresses torn, floorboards pried, even the stovepipe dismantled. Klara stood rigid, heart hammering against her ribs. As an SS man shoved his hand into her coat pocket, empty except for a single raisin saved from last week's ration, he sneered and moved on. But the message was clear. They were watching. Paranoia thickened the air like coal smoke. That night, Marta urged delay. "They're hunting ghosts," she whispered. "Let them chase shadows while we bide time." But Klara shook her head. Delay meant more deaths. Every day in Osterode stole breath, bone, will, and winter was coming. The snow would erase their trails, yes, but it would also slow them, freeze them, make them visible against white fields. They had to move before the first snowfall. The date was set, November 3rd. The night of the thinnest moon, the morning of the quarry's shift change, the hour when the world held its breath. The camp's Sicherheitsdienst officer Leutnant Drescher prided himself on order. To him, the women were interchangeable units of labor, bodies that ate, worked, and occasionally died. He dismissed the notion of escape as Slavic fantasy, citing Reich statistics that claimed fewer than 0.3% of gross-rosen subcamp prisoners ever breached perimeter wire. When a rumor surfaced of phantom maps circulating among Block 14, he scoffed during the weekly commandant briefing. "Breadcrumbs," he laughed, swirling Erzatz coffee in a chipped mug. "Next, they'll claim the sparrows carry coded messages in their beaks." His superiors agreed. After all, the camp's design was flawless. Double fences, tripwire alarms, patrols with trained Alsatians, and a dead zone of gravel between the inner and outer barriers that crunched under the lightest step. No map, however clever, could overcome physics. Klara heard none of this. She wasn't invited to briefings, but she saw the consequences. Random cell inspections increased, rations halved, and the block elder replaced with a Volksdeutsch informant who watched every hand movement. Still, Klara adapted. She stopped drawing full maps, instead encoding segments into daily routines. A crumb dropped near the laundry line meant river crossing. A smudge of charcoal on a spoon handle signaled wait for moonless night. LSCL became her courier, his small size and silence rendering him invisible. Once, a guard kicked over his bowl of turnip soup, shouting, "Move, pest." The boy didn't flinch. He'd learned that stillness was armor. When Marta suggested waiting for winter when snow might muffle footsteps, Klara shook her head. "Winter brings more guards, not fewer. We go in the fog." Drescher never considered fog. He trusted wires and dogs, not weather. His confidence was rooted in data, or what passed for it in the SS bureaucracy. Every escape attempt from gross-rosen's network since 1940 had followed predictable patterns. Tunnels dug beneath latrines, forged passes, traded for gold teeth, desperate sprints across open fields. All had failed. All had been documented, dissected, and used to reinforce protocol. Drescher had memorized the case files like scripture. He knew that emotional panic led to reckless action, that hunger bred short-term thinking, that women, especially mothers, were less likely to flee without guarantees for their children. What he did not know, could not fathom, was a plan built not on speed or force, but on erasure, on the deliberate absence of evidence. To him, intelligence required paper, radio signals, hidden ink. He had no category for knowledge that lived only in memory, transmitted through crumbs, dissolved by saliva. When the new block elder, Gertrude Vogel, a sharp-eyed widow from Danzig who'd joined the camp staff to feed her own children, reported suspicious gestures among the Hungarian women, Drescher ordered increased surveillance, but no arrests. Arrests created martyrs. He preferred the slow squeeze, reduced soup portions, extra roll calls in the rain, the public beating of a random prisoner to induce collective dread. On October 28, he selected Zofia, the printer's daughter, for disciplinary re-education after she was caught humming a Polish lullaby. They dragged her into the yard at dusk, and the sound of the whip cracked like dry bones snapping. Klara watched from the window, her jaw clenched so hard her molars ached, but her hands remained steady as she folded laundry. Panic was a luxury. Grief was a distraction. Survival demanded subtraction, strip away everything but the next breath, the next step. That night, she found Elisiel trembling under their shared blanket. She pulled him close, not with comfort, but with calculation. "Remember the birch grove," she whispered into his hair. 3 blinks for safe, 2 for stop. He nodded against her collarbone, his tears soaking into her threadbare shift. They would not break, not yet. Drescher's arrogance deepened as November approached. He'd received commendation for excellent camp discipline from the regional SSWVHA office, and rumors spread that he might be transferred to a desk post in Breslau, a promotion, a reprieve from the mud and stench of Ost. He began to pack his personal effects, a photograph of his fiancée in Dresden, a silver flask, a copy of Mein Kampf, with handwritten margin notes. His attention drifted. Patrols became perfunctory. The generator shift at 3 a.m., once monitored with military precision, was now handled by a drowsy conscript who lit cigarettes in the control shed, ignoring the flicker in the eastern Klara noted it all. She saw the slack in the tripwire near the drainage pipe, corroded by autumn rains. She saw the Alsatian's ribs showing beneath its coat, its handler grumbling about cut rations for beasts. She saw the new guard on the East Tower bare, fiddling with a harmonica during his shift, eyes scanning the horizon for signs of Allied bombers, not as the camp was rotting from within, its rigidity cracking under the weight of its own bureaucracy. And Klara, silent and observant, was mapping the fractures. On the evening of November 1st, Marta found her in the potato cellar, peeling tubers with numb fingers. "Vogel watches you like a hawk," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the drip of condensation from the ceiling beams. "She thinks you're the leader." Klara didn't look up. Let her think it. Leaders get shot first. I'm just a mother feeding her son. But the truth was more dangerous. She wasn't leading. She was enabling. Each woman carried only her section of the route, knew only her signal. If captured, none could betray the whole. It was a network without a center, a plan without a planner, just a series of quiet agreements, held together by hunger and hope. Marta handed her a small cloth pouch. Inside, 3 lumps of hardened soap, a bent pin, and a sliver of coal wrapped in waxed paper. "From Irena," she said. For Barta and picking locks, Klara tucked it into her waistband, against her skin. That night, she and Elisiel rehearsed the final sequence: crawl through the drain, follow the creek bed for 400 paces, then climb the ridge where the birches began. No words, just movement. In the dark, she pressed his small hand to the floorboard where she'd once drawn the map. "Feel it," she whispered. He nodded. The route was no longer bread or charcoal. It was muscle memory. It was breath. Drescher, meanwhile, celebrated his impending transfer with a bottle of schnapps in the officer's mess, laughing about peasant superstitions and bread witchcraft. He never checked the storm drain. He never questioned why the dogs grew quiet on foggy nights. He assumed obedience was bred into the prisoners as naturally as fur on a hound. And so, on the eve of November 3rd, as the first tendrils of river fog began to coil through the valley, he turned off his desk lamp with a sigh of contentment, unaware that in Block 14, 9 pairs of eyes were open, 9 hearts beating in silent synchrony, 9 bodies coiled like springs beneath threadbare blankets, all waiting for the world to disappear into mist. The escape began at 3:02 a.m. on November 3, 1942. During a thick river fog that rolled through the valley like milk spilled over glass, Klara led with Elisiel tucked against her side, both wrapped in stolen burlap sacks stiff with dried mud. They moved, not in a line but in a staggered sequence, women, spaced 30 meters apart, each carrying only what they could swallow or hide in their hair, a sliver of soap for barter, a pin for picking locks, a single crumb map pressed into the heel of a shoe. The first test came at the inner fence, the tripwire. Klara had observed that the wire sagged slightly where it passed over a buried drainage pipe, weakened by seasonal frost heave. She lay flat, belly to the gravel, and inched beneath, feeling the wire hum above her like a plucked string. Elisiel followed, his breath a ghost against her neck. At the outer fence, the dogs stirred, but the fog, muffled scent, and the guards, lulled by routine, failed to notice the faint rustle of burlap against barbed wire. The real trial came at the watchtower blind spot. the collapsed stairwell Klara had marked months earlier. Here, the ground sloped sharply into a dry creek bed, shielded by overgrowth. They crawled, elbows raw, until the camp's lights faded behind them. By dawn, all 9 had crossed the Olza, slipping into the birch forest where Czech partisans waited with dry socks and forged papers. No alarms sounded, no shots rang out, only the slow drip of fog from branches and the distant clang of the quarry's morning siren, calling laborers who would never return. The Germans discovered the escape at roll call. Drescher paced the empty bunks, face pale, muttering, "Impossible." They had no tools, no maps, but the evidence was Gnetten, erased, breathed into the air. Klara's body moved on instinct, every nerve tuned to the slightest shift in sound or air pressure. The gravel crunched under her palms like brittle bones, but the fog absorbed the noise, wrapping them in a cocoon of damp silence. Behind her, Zofia paused at the tripwire, her breath catching as the wire trembled, but she exhaled slowly, lowered herself, and slid through like smoke. Marta came last, her movements deliberate, her eyes scanning the tower silhouette for any sign of movement. None came. The sentry Hubner stood with his back turned, lighting a cigarette, the flare of his match briefly illuminating the mist before vanishing. They timed their passage between his drags. At the storm drain, LSCL went first, small enough to slip through without scraping metal. Klara followed, her ribs scraping against rusted iron, her pulse roaring in her ears, but she did not stop. On the other side, damp earth greeted her hands, cool and rich with the scent of decaying leaves. She signaled with 2 fingers against LSCL's back. Safe. One by one, the others emerged, damp and shivering but intact. The creek bed offered cover, its banks high and choked with brambles. They moved in single file, no words, no glances back. Klara counted paces in her head: 50, 100, 200, 100, till the birch grove loomed ahead, silver trunks glowing faintly in the pre-dawn gloom. There, beneath the outstretched arms of the trees, a figure waited, a man in a sheepskin vest, face shadowed by a fur cap, holding a lantern with its light cupped in cloth. He raised a hand, palm out a partisan signal Klara had memorized from whispered descriptions. She returned it, thumb pressed to her forehead. No names were exchanged. None were needed. Blankets were handed over, then boot-stiff but dry-and, small packets of dried meat wrapped in wax paper. Irana wept silently as she pulled on socks, her blistered feet finally sheltered. Hannah scanned the horizon, her farmer's eyes reading the land like a familiar page. They would rest here only until first light, then move deeper into the hills, where a safe house waited near the Czech border. Back at Osterode, confusion reigned. Roll calls stretched into chaos as capo after capo counted and recounted empty bunks. Drescher arrived in his greatcoat, unshaven, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep and disbelief. He stormed into Block 14, overturning stools, tearing, bedding, demanding names, but there was nothing, no scraps, no tools, no hidden notes. Even the floorboards yielded only dust and mouse droppings. Vogel, the informant, stood trembling in the corner. They spoke in blinks. She stammered, "I saw, but I didn't understand." Drescher backhanded her so hard she fell against the stove. "Lies," he roared. "Women don't escape like ghosts." Yet, the math was undeniable. 9 prisoners missing, no breach in security, no alarm triggered. The only anomaly was the storm drain butt. When his men inspected it, they found only mud, a few bent reeds, and the lingering smell of damp wool. No footprints, no fibers, nothing to photograph, nothing to report. By mid-morning, the SS had launched a dragnet, patrols fanned out along known roads, checkpoints doubled, farmers questioned at gunpoint. But they searched for fugitives with papers, with directions, with stolen uniforms. They did not look for people who moved like mist, who carried no maps, who left no trail because their maps had been digested, their plans dissolved into memory. The partisans led Klara's group through goat paths and abandoned mine shafts, routes known only to shepherds and smugglers. At the safe house, a stone cottage, nestled in a ravine, a woman with kind eyes fed them barley soup and stitched a tear in Elisseel's coat. "You're the bread map women," she said softly, not as a question, but as recognition. Word had spread. Hope had a name now, even if it was unspoken. Drescher filed his report that evening, his handwriting tight with fury and humiliation. Subject group vanished under fog cover. No evidence of external assistance. Recommend reclassification of Block 14 as high risk. but the recommendation was ignored. Higher command had larger concerns: Stalingrad collapsing, Allied bombers over Hamburgond. The disappearance of 9 female laborers from a minor subcamp was a footnote, a statistical anomaly soon buried in paperwork. Drescher remained at Osterode, his transfer revoked, his reputation stained. He began inspecting every loaf of bread delivered to the camp, slicing it open on the mess hall table like a pathologist examining a corpse. But the secret was already gone, carried in bellies and bones across borders, for Klara and the others. Freedom was not a single moment, but a slow unfurling. They traveled by night, hid by day, passed from hand to hand like fragile contraband. In Prague, they were given new names, new birthplaces, new pasts. Elasil, now Petr Novak, learned Czech within weeks, his Hungarian accent fading like a bruise. Klara never spoke of Osterode, not to the partisans, not to the Red Cross workers who processed them in Brno, not even to the school principal who hired her to teach geography in a quiet village outside Olomouc. She taught children to read topographic maps, to understand contour lines and watershed divides, and sometimes, when the classroom was empty and the lights slanted just right through the tall windows, she'd take a piece of rye bread from her lunch, press it gently into the grooves of a wooden desk, and watch the grain absorb the shape of the land. Temporary, edible, true. By January 1943, the Osterode pattern had spread. Partisan cells from Silesia to Moravia adopted Klara's method, edible cartography, transient by design, leaving no paper trail for Gestapo raids. In Prague, a baker began kneading escape routes into loaves delivered to labor camps. In Bratislava, children traded bread stamps that, when moistened, revealed safe houses. The tactic was never formalized, never credited, because to name it was to risk its death. Klara and Elasil reached Budapest in February, hidden in a coal wagon, their identities assumed under forged ration cards. She never spoke of Osterode again, not even when her son, decades later, found a single charred crumb tucked inside her copy of Robinson Crusoe, the only keepsake she carried from the war. Historians would later estimate that between late 1942 and mid-1944, at least 47 documented escapes from gross-rosen subcamps used variations of the bread map technique, contributing to a 38% increase in successful civilian breakouts from Silesian labor camps during that period. Klara received no medal, filed no report, sought no witness stand. She taught school again, this time in a sunlit classroom in Vienna, where she showed children how to draw continents on apple peels and navigate by starlight. When asked why she never wrote her story, she'd smile faintly and say, "Some truths are too fragile for paper. They only live in the hands that made them." And in the quiet hum of a classroom, with chalk dust floating like snow, it was enough. The method endured, not through doctrine, but through mimicry passed in whispers, in shared glances, in the quiet solidarity of those who knew that survival sometimes required dissolving your plans before they could be discovered. In Auschwitz-Birkenau's Kanada warehouse, a Slovak Jewish seamstress began embroidering compass roses into the linings of confiscated coats, using thread pulled from prisoners' uniforms. In Ravensbrück, women used onion skin layers to sketch guard rotations, eating the evidence after memorization. These were not grand conspiracies, but intimate rebellions, acts of defiance, so small they slipped through the cracks of surveillance. The SS never understood them because they looked for grandeur, radios, forged documents, tunnels. They did not consider that resistance could be baked, chewed, and digested, could vanish like breath in winter air. Klara settled in Vienna in 1951, in a modest apartment overlooking a cobblestone courtyard where chestnut trees bloomed each May. She taught at a gymnasium, not as Frau Varga from Budapest, but as Frau Kovacs, a widow from Linz, another layer, in a life rebuilt from erasures. Her classroom walls held maps of the world, but none of Silesia. She never corrected students who mispronounced Krakow or mislabeled the Oza. The past was a room she kept locked, not out of shame, but out of respect for its fragility. LSEL grew into a quiet man, an engineer who designed irrigation systems for arid regions of vocation routed. Perhaps, in his childhood memory of a dry creek bed that once led to freedom, he married a Czech woman, raised 2 daughters, and never asked his mother about the war. He knew better than to demand ghosts speak. Yet traces remained, on winter mornings, when frost etched patterns on the window pane. Klara would sometimes pause at the sink, her hands still for a moment too long, or when bread was served at dinner, dense, dark rye, the kind that held its shape, she'd break it slowly, deliberately, as if testing its memory. Once, during a school field trip to the Danube, a student dropped a crumb into the river and watched it swirl away. "It's gone," the boy said, disappointed. Klara knelt beside him, her knees stiff with age, and pointed to the water's surface. "Not gone," she said softly, "just changed. It feeds the fish. It becomes current. It moves on." The boy frowned, unconvinced, but years later, he would recall her words during his own exile, crossing the Hungarian border on foot in 1956, with nothing but a crust of bread in his pocket, and a route memorized from whispered lullabies. Official records barely mention her. The gross-rosen archives list Klara Varga as transferred, status unknown, a bureaucratic euphemism for vanished. Drescher's name appears in denazification, files denied pension, died in 1968, unrepentant to the end. But in the footnotes of resistance histories, in oral testimonies gathered by Czech and Polish researchers in the 1980s, fragments surface. A teacher from Budapest, the woman who drew with crumbs, the mother who made maps disappear. None name her directly, none need to. Her legacy was never in documents, but in the countless who followed her silent logic that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to leave no trace behind. Decades later, in a museum in Warsaw, a small exhibit titled Invisible Resistance displayed a single artifact, a loaf of replica rye bread, its crust imprinted with faint lines resembling a river valley. Beside it, a placard read, "Used by unknown prisoners in gross-rosen subcamps, 1942, 1944. No originals survive." Visitors paused, puzzled. How could bread be a weapon? But those who understood former partisans, camp survivors, historians who had listened to enough whispered testimonies, knew the truth. The weapon wasn't the bread, it was the mind that saw possibility in scarcity, the hand that turned hunger into strategy, the silence that refused to leave a trail. Klara died in 1994. At 83, in her Vienna apartment, with sunlight on the floorboards and a half-eaten slice of rye on her plate. LCL found her that afternoon, her head resting on a geography textbook, her fingers lightly curled as if holding something invisible. At the funeral, no speeches were made about heroism, only a single line from a student's note. "She taught us that the world is knowable, if you learn to look closely." And perhaps that was the final map she left, not of rivers or borders, but of attention itself. The quiet, relentless act of seeing what others ignore, and trusting that observation, however humble, can alter the course of things. In a century obsessed with monuments and manifestos, Klara's revolution was edible, ephemeral, and utterly effective proof that sometimes the most enduring truths are the ones you must consume to keep alive.